The summons came on the morning of the 12th night ball, sealed in royal wax, and the man who carried it to the door of the dower house did not lower his eyes when he handed it across, because the household had already decided what she was. Eleanor read the single line standing in the cold hall, her gloves still buttoned, and the words inside it told her that the Crown had granted the disputed Hartwell lands and the wardship of her late husband's title to a cousin she had met twice, that the grant bore the King's own hand, and that she was to vacate the rooms she had kept for 9 years, by the Feast of Candlemas. The footman waited for her to weep. She folded the letter along its existing crease and slid it into the pocket sewn inside her plain grey mantle, where another letter already lived, and she said only that she would dress for the ball. Behind her, in the doorway of the morning room, the Dowager Lady Margaret Hartwell let her fan close with a small dry click, and remarked to the woman beside her that it was a mercy truly for the widow to be released at last from pretending she belonged among them. To the great house, to the season, to the county, that had watched her bury a duke and raise his orphaned ward alone, Eleanor was the impostor in the dower house, the woman who had married above her blood and outlived her usefulness. That was the verdict. She had spent 9 years preparing a quiet answer to it, and the answer was sealed in wax of its own, and she carried it now against her ribs, where her heart was beating in a way she did not permit her face to show. Stay with me through this one, because the woman they had decided not to see had read the law more carefully than the man who wrote the letter, and a duke who had not spoken her name aloud in a year was about to cross a ballroom to do it. What none of them knew yet was why he had stopped speaking it at all. To understand the cold of that hall, you had to understand the house, and to understand the house you had to go back 9 years. To the autumn Eleanor Vane married Charles Hartwell against the explicit advice of every relation he possessed. He was the 4th Duke of Hartwell, a widower, twice her age, gentle and tired and grateful, and the county said she had trapped him with a pretty face and a clever tongue, because the county could not imagine that a man of his rank might simply have wanted the company of someone who read the same books he did and laughed at the same quiet things. They had 3 years together before the wasting illness took him, and in those years she learned the estate from the rent rolls upward, walked the tenant farms, sat with the steward over the drainage of the low fields, because Charles had asked her to and because she found she had a head for it. He left her the dower house, a modest jointure, and the wardship of his great-nephew Thomas, a boy of 4 whose own parents had drowned crossing to Ireland. Thomas was 6 now, grave and watchful, with his great-uncle's habit of going still when he was frightened, and he was the reason Eleanor had not simply taken her jointure and gone to live small and unbothered in Bath. The boy was a Hartwell. The title, the lands, the wardship were tangled together in an entail nobody had read closely in 2 generations, and Lady Margaret, the 3rd Duke's widow, had spent those 2 generations certain that she understood it. She did not. That was the thing none of them suspected. Eleanor, in 9 years of long winter evenings, with nothing but the estate papers and a single candle, had read every clause, every codicil, every faded marginal note in the hand of a long-dead solicitor, and she had found the place where the entail and the Crown's own grant could not both be true at once. The man who had stopped speaking her name was not Charles. Charles was 3 years in the churchyard. The man was Henry Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Wexford, whose estate marched along the eastern boundary of the Hartwell lands, and whose late wife had been Charles Hartwell's cousin and dearest friend. Eleanor had known him as a fixture of the family before she was anything to it. A tall, composed man with a jaw like carved stone and eyes the color of wood smoke, who had stood at Charles's funeral with his gloved hands folded and had said exactly the right things and nothing more. For 2 years after, when estate business required it, the Duke of Wexford had ridden over, had sat across the steward's table from her, had used her name plainly and without weight. Mrs. Hartwell, the Duchess, in the level voice of a man who found her competent and trusted her judgment. Then, a little over a year ago, he had stopped. He sent his steward instead. He bowed to her, across rooms, and did not approach. When their paths crossed at the assembly, he inclined his head and turned to speak with someone else, and the county, which read everything, decided he had finally seen what they had always seen, that the widow was a small embarrassment best kept at a distance. Eleanor decided the same thing, because her wound told her to. She had learned, in the years of being the imposter, that the surest way to survive a verdict was to agree with it before anyone could press it on you. She did not let herself wonder what his stillness meant. She had taught herself not to look at the place where he stood in a room, which was its own kind of looking, and which she did not examine. The dower house at dawn was cold in a way. The great house never was, because Eleanor kept only 2 fires, made sure one of them was always the nursery's. On the morning the summons came, she had been awake since 4, not from grief, though grief was a tenant that never fully left, but because Thomas had a cough, and she had sat up with him reading aloud from a book of voyages in a low, even voice until the boy slept. This was the thing the county did not see, and would not have valued if it had. She read to a sick child at 4 in the morning in an unheated room, with her own breath visible in the candlelight, and she did it not for any witness, because there was none, but because the boy was afraid of the dark, and she was the only person left in the world who had promised his dead parents she would mind him. She did not know that there had been a witness once, months ago, a different cold morning, when the Duke of Wexford had ridden over before light on some matter of a strayed horse, and had stood unannounced in the dark passage outside the nursery, and heard a woman's voice steady against a child's fear, and had not gone in, and had not been able afterward to make himself ride over again. She did not know that. She knew only that the cough was easing, and that today she would have to put on her one good gown and stand in a ballroom full of people who had been told she was leaving, and smile, because Thomas would be watching, and she would not teach him that the world could make her flinch. The Hartwell ball was held in the great house every 12th night, and every 12th night for 9 years Eleanor had attended it, as a kind of penance. The widow in the corner, whom the dowager invited because not inviting her would have been a public cut, and the dowager preferred her cruelties private. This year the cruelty had been made public, the grant signed, the eviction dated, and so the dowager could afford to be gracious in the candlelight, which was worse. The ballroom was everything the dower house was not, a long gold room lit by 400 candles, the orchestra in the gallery, the terrace doors thrown open to the frost so that the heat of the dancing could escape, and the cold air came in smelling of snow. Pucks. Eleanor stood near the wall, in a gown of soft green, that had been turned and retrimmed 3 times and was, she knew, 2 seasons out of any fashion that mattered, and she watched the diamonds move. Lady Margaret presided from a gilt chair beneath the largest chandelier, her fan held at a height calibrated to her certainty, and at her right hand sat the rival the season had appointed, Miss Cassandra Fenwick, 19, and lovely, and dressed in ice-blue silk, who was understood by everyone present to be the future of the family the moment the cousin took possession. Eleanor felt the cold come in through the terrace doors and was glad of it. It gave her face something to do besides arrange itself. He came in at 10. She knew it, the way she always knew it, by the way the room reorganized itself around a still point, and she did not look. She kept her eyes on the dancers and her hands folded, and she felt the Duke of Wexford enter the ballroom the way one feels weather change. He was in dark blue, the cravat white and exact, and he crossed the room toward the dowager's chair to make his bow, as rank required. And Eleanor watched the diamonds part for him, and told herself that this was nothing to her. To her. Then she felt the change in him, a stillness inside the larger stillness, and she understood that he had seen her, and she made herself breathe. He bowed to Lady Margaret. He greeted Miss Fenwick with the exact courtesy owed a girl of her station. And then, instead of taking the chair the dowager indicated, he stood, and his eyes moved across the gold room and found the woman in the retrimmed green gown against the wall, and for one moment that the whole front of the room could see if it cared to. The Duke of Wexford looked at her as though she were the only fixed thing in a room of moving lights. He looked away again. He was a disciplined man. The dowager, however, had seen it, and her fan paused at its measured height, and something behind her composed face began, very slightly, to calculate. What he did, then he did without announcement. He did not ask Eleanor to dance, which would have been a declaration. The season could not have survived his gossip. He waited until the music turned until the dowager was occupied with a duchess of higher rank, and he moved along the edge of the room with the unhurried certainty of a man who has decided something and is merely arranging its execution. And he stopped beside Eleanor at the wall, close enough that she could not pretend she had not seen him, and he said, his voice low and level that the terrace doors were letting in the cold, and she had no shawl. It was not a question. It was the first thing he had said directly to her in over a year, and it was a command shaped like a complaint about the architecture. And underneath the command was the only tenderness a man of his discipline could permit himself, which was attention to the fact that she was cold. Eleanor looked up at him. Her mouth said that she was perfectly comfortable. "Thank you, Your Grace," in the smooth, deflecting voice of a woman who has survived 9 years by never appearing to need anything. Her hand, of its own accord, had risen to the place at her collarbone where a shawl would have lain. He saw it. He always saw it. He inclined his head and did not press, and he moved away to speak with a magistrate near the orchestra, and Eleanor stood with her pulse loud in her throat and was furious at her own hand. The dowager voiced the verdict for the second time an hour later, in a public exchange near the supper room, and she did it loudly enough to be overheard, which was the point. A cluster of guests had formed near the long windows, and the conversation had turned, as it was meant to the great news of the grant, and the cousin's coming, and the kindness of the king in settling so untidy a matter. Lady Margaret, with Miss Fenwick at her elbow, observed to the company that it had all gone on far too long as it was, that the late Duke had been a generous man to a fault, and that one could not, after all, expect a woman of no particular family to understand when a thing was finished. She said it pleasantly. She said it with a smile in Eleanor's direction, an inclusion that was a blade. The impostor in the dower house, she did not say. But the words arranged themselves in every listening mind, and the cluster of guests performed the small social ripple of people agreeing without speaking, a turning of shoulders, a lift of brows, a few cool glances that found Eleanor where she stood and dismissed her. Eleanor held the dowager's gaze, and inclined her head as though thanking her for her concern, and across the room the Duke of Wexford, who could not have heard the words at that distance, went very still over the glass he was not drinking, because he had seen the shoulders turn, and he knew the shape of a room closing against a person, and his jaw set in a way the magistrate beside him noticed and decided not to remark upon. She did not break in the ballroom. She broke a little in the carriage going home, and only because Thomas was asleep against her side and could not see. The grant was signed. The king's hand was on it. She had her sealed letter and her 9 years of reading. But a letter against the king was a small and dangerous thing, and for the length of 1 cold mile she let herself feel the full weight of what it would mean to be wrong, to be cast out not only from the house, but from the law's protection. Ah! To take a 6-year-old boy into rented rooms in a strange town with a jointure that would not stretch and a name the county had taught itself to pity. Then the carriage passed the lodge gate, and she folded the feeling away along its crease, the way she folded everything, and she carried the sleeping child up the cold stair herself, rather than wake the one tired maid, and she sat by the nursery fire until her hands stopped shaking, and she did not let the shaking reach the part of her that had a plan. The plan rested on a single fact, and the fact was this. The Hartwell entail, drawn 3 generations back, named the line of succession with a particular and old-fashioned precision, and the disputed lands the crown had just granted to the cousin were not, in the strict letter of that entail, the duke's to leave or the crown's to grant, because they were settled lands, tied to the wardship of the heir, held in trust for whoever should be the duke's lawful ward. At his death, Thomas was that ward. Charles had made it so in the last codicil he signed, 3 weeks before he died, with Eleanor and the old steward and the vicar as witnesses, a codicil so quiet and so legally exact that the family solicitor had filed it and forgotten it, and the dowager had never known it existed. The lands the king had just signed away to the cousin belonged, in law, not to the cousin, and not even to Eleanor, but to a 6-year-old boy, with Eleanor as the trustee of them, until his majority. The king had signed the wrong name. He had signed the name his ministers gave him, the cousin's name, on a petition that had concealed the codicil, and a crown grant founded on a concealment was a grant that could be challenged, and the challenge had to be lodged with the right authority, with the documents in hand before the cousin took possession at Candlemas. Eleanor had prepared for this. She had a fair copy of the codicil and the original under seal, she had the steward's sworn memory, and the vicar's, and she had been waiting, through 9 years of being thought a fool, for the day the hierarchy would overreach far enough to make its own machinery the proof of her standing. The signed grant in her mantle pocket was not her defeat. It was the last piece of her case. 3 days after the ball, the Duke of Wexford came to the Dower House himself. He came at an hour that was almost proper, mid-morning, with the frost still on the grass, and he came on a matter he had constructed as a state business, a question about the boundary of the low fields that did not in truth require a duke to ask it. And Eleanor received him in the small, cold morning room because it was the only room fit to receive anyone in. And she was aware the whole time of the turned letter against her ribs, and of the exact distance between his chair and hers. He asked his boundary question. She answered it from memory. The acreage and the drainage and the old dispute, and she watched something in his composed face ease as she spoke, as though her competence were a thing he had ridden over to be reassured still existed. Then, instead of leaving, he stayed, and he asked, in the level voice that gave nothing away, whether the matter of the grant was settled, whether she had somewhere to go. It was not a question a man asked unless he had been turning the answer over in the dark. Eleanor said that she had made arrangements. She did not say what they were. She had learned never to show the hand before the table was set. He looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sensation, unfamiliar and unwelcome, of being seen all the way down, of her composure being recognized as composure, rather than mistaken for coldness, and she did not know what to do with it. And so she stood and thanked him for his interest in the boundary, and he rose because he was a gentleman. And at the door he paused, and said that she should not let pride keep her from accepting help where it was honestly offered. Eleanor said that she had found over the years that help offered to a woman in her position generally had a price she could not afford. It was the closest she had come to the truth of her wound in a year, and she regretted it the instant it left her, because his face changed just at the jaw, just at the eyes, and she understood that she had wounded him without meaning to, and that she did not know why she could. It was the steward who told her, a week later, the thing that explained the Duke of Wexford. Old Pengelly had served the Hartwells and known the Wexfords 40 years, and he told her the story not as gossip, but as a thing she ought to know if she was to deal with a man, and he told it dry and plain over the rent rolls. The 5th Duke of Wexford had married for love against his family's wish, a gentle, clever woman of small fortune named Anne, who had been Charles's cousin and Eleanor's friend in the brief years of her marriage. Anne had died 4 years ago, in the winter, of a fever that began as nothing, and the Duke had been in London when it turned, kept there by a matter of business he could have left, and did not, because the physicians had said there was no danger and he had believed them, and he had come home to a closed house, and a turned portrait, and a grave, already filled. He had not failed to love her, he had failed to be there. By the width of a single decision, a business matter weighed against a fever called harmless, and he had never since been able to forgive himself the arithmetic. He kept, Pengelly said, a small thing of hers always on him, a folded letter, the last she had written him, which he had received the day after she died, and which the household believed he had never been able to read. That was the wound. A man who had once weighed his presence against his work and chosen wrong, and lost everything to the choosing, and had taught himself since to be present, to ride over before light because a horse had strayed, to notice when a woman had no shawl, to stand in a dark passage and hear a child comforted, and be unable to walk away, and unable to walk in. He had stopped speaking Eleanor's name a year ago, Pengelly did not say. But Eleanor now understood, not because he had at last seen her as the county saw her, but because he had begun to feel something he had no right to feel so soon, and could not be near her without it, and had chosen distance the way a burned man chooses distance from fire, mistaking caution for kindness. Eleanor sat with that a long time after the steward had gone. It rearranged a year of evidence. The bow across the room that she had read as dismissal. The steward sent in his place. The turned shoulder at the assembly. She had built a whole structure of her own unworthiness on those bricks. And now the bricks were something else entirely. And she did not let herself believe it, because believing it was more dangerous than the eviction. A woman in her position could survive being thought worthless. She was not certain she could survive being wrong about it. So she put the new understanding away with the rest, along the crease, and she went back to her case. Because Candlemas was 3 weeks off, and the boys' lands would not save themselves with feeling. The dowager moved first, and she moved in the assembly rooms at Candlemas Eve, in front of the entire county, which was the third voicing of the verdict, and the one she had been saving. The cousin had arrived from town, a soft-handed young man named Mr. Byng. Crandall, who smiled too readily, and called Eleanor cousin in a voice that made the word an insult. And the dowager presented him to the assembly as the new master of Hartwell, with the grant's authority behind her and the king's name as her shield. When Eleanor entered plainly dressed, holding Thomas by the hand because she would not leave the boy at home to be told later how his inheritance had been given away, Lady Margaret turned to the room and said in a voice pitched for the whole long gallery that she hoped the company would be gentle with the poor woman, who had clung so long and so touchingly to a place that was never truly hers, and who must now learn, as we all must, where she belonged. The gallery went quiet in the particular way a crowd goes quiet, when it has been invited to enjoy a cruelty. Miss Fenwick smiled behind her fan. Mr. Crandall examined his cuff. And Eleanor felt the old cold flush rise at her wrists, the body's truth running ahead of her will, and she felt Thomas's small hand tighten in hers, and she made the single most important decision of the night, which was not to weep, and not to flee, but to stand exactly where she was, and let the room look, because she had learned that a verdict spoken too confidently is a verdict that can be made to answer for itself. She let the silence stretch. She let the dowager enjoy it. And then she said, in a clear, even voice that carried to the gallery's far end, that since the matter of belonging had been raised so publicly, perhaps it was the proper hour to settle it, and that she had brought, as it happened, the documents that would. The Duke of Wexford was in the gallery. He had come, the county would say afterward, merely as a neighbor of rank, and he stood near the tall windows at the far end, and he had heard every word the dowager said, and when Eleanor spoke, he went, still in the way that meant his whole attention had narrowed to a point. He did not move yet. He was a man who understood that some moments belong to the person inside them, and that to step in too soon is to take the moment away. So he watched, with his gloved hands folded and his jaw like carved stone, as Eleanor Hartwell drew from inside her plain mantle, not the grant they expected her to wave in futile protest, but a different document, under a different seal, and unfolded it, and held it up so the candlelight caught the old solicitor's hand and the vicar's signature and the steward's, and began in the level voice of a woman who had read every clause 100 times by a single candle, to explain to the assembled county exactly what the king had signed and exactly why it was wrong. She explained the codicil. She explained the settled lands, tied to the wardship, held in trust for the duke's lawful ward, and she named the ward, and the room turned as one to look at the grave small boy holding her hand. She explained that the petition to the crown had concealed the codicil, that a grant founded on concealment was a grant that could not stand, and that she had, that very week, lodged a formal challenge with the proper authority, with the original codicil under seal as its foundation, and that until the challenge was heard, no possession could lawfully be taken, not at Candlemas, not at all, by Mr. Crandall, or by anyone. The soft-handed cousin had stopped smiling. The dowager's fan had come down from its measured height, and was gripped now in a hand that had forgotten it. Lady Margaret said, into the silence, that this was absurd, that the king's own name was on the grant, that no widow's paper could stand against the crown. And Eleanor said gently that the crown had not been given the truth, and that the codicil did not stand against the king, It stood beneath him where the king himself would wish the law to stand, and that the boy's right was older than the grant by 3 weeks and a dead man's signature. The gallery had begun to make the low sound of a crowd, reassembling its understanding of who a person is. It was then that the Duke of Wexford crossed the room. He did it without haste, 3 long strides into the silence the documents had built, and the county watched the most disciplined man in the county walk the length of the gallery to stand beside the widow, in the retrimmed mantle, and he turned to face the dowager and the cousin and the whole assembled season. In a voice level and low and entirely without doubt, I will stand surety for the Duchess and her ward. 6 words, and a name claimed, and a public defense uttered, and the thing was done. A duke of his rank standing surety meant the challenge had a great house behind it, meant the lawyers would be paid, and the case would be heard, and the cousin would face not a friendless widow, but the law with the Wexford fortune at its back, and every person in the gallery understood the arithmetic of it in the same instant. The dowager's certainty, which had survived 9 years because nothing had ever stood against it with equal weight, fragmented visibly. She said the duke's name once, as a question, as though asking him to take it back. He did not look at her. He was looking at Eleanor, and what was on his face was not triumph, because he was not a man who triumphed, but something quieter and more permanent. The look of a man who has finally stepped into a fire he had been circling for a year. The room did not cheer, because it was not that kind of room, but it shifted, and the shift was its own verdict. Reversing. Mr. Crandall murmured something about consulting his own solicitors, and withdrew toward the card room with the particular gait of a man recalculating his future. Miss Fenwick lowered her fan and looked at the dowager with the first genuine expression of the evening, which was the dawning understanding of a girl who has been told her whole life that she was the correct choice, and is realizing in a candlelit gallery that the choosing was never going to be hers. And Lady Margaret the Dowager stood very straight in her gilt-trimmed gown, with her fan at her side, and she looked at Eleanor for a long moment, and the cruelty went out of her face and left behind it something older and more tired, the face of a woman whose entire certainty had been a kind of armor against the fear that she had spent her life protecting a thing that did not need her. And she inclined her head a half-inch, the smallest correction the county had ever seen her make, and she said with the dignity of the genuinely defeated, that she had not known about the codicil. It was as close to an apology as her nature could produce, and Eleanor, who did not gloat, who had never in 9 years gloated, accepted it with an inclination of her own. And the 2 women understood each other across the gallery for the first and only time, the protector of the order, and the woman the order could not measure, each recognizing in the other a competence she had refused to see. Thomas tugged at Eleanor's hand and asked in the clear, carrying voice of a tired 6-year-old whether they might go home now, and the gallery, which had been holding its breath, released it in something that was almost laughter. The warm, helpless laughter of people relieved to be reminded that the world contained small, ordinary needs. Eleanor said yes, that they might go home now, and the word home, which the dowager had used that very evening as a weapon, meaning the place where Eleanor did not belong, was returned to its true meaning in the boy's question and Eleanor's answer. And everyone in the gallery heard the difference. The Duke of Wexford walked them to their carriage. He did not say a great deal. He handed Thomas up first, with a gravity the boy seemed to find satisfactory, and then he turned to Eleanor in the cold under the carriage lamp, and the frost was coming down fine and slow, and he said, the words level, but no longer guarded, that he had heard her once, months ago, reading to the boy before light, and had not been able to ride over since, and had been a coward about it, and was done being one. Eleanor stood with the snow settling on her shawl, the shawl she had finally accepted from his hands at the gallery door, without quite noticing she had, and she understood at last the shape of the year, and her hand rose again to her collarbone, and this time she let it. The challenge was heard in the spring, and it held, because it had been built by a woman who had read every clause, and the settled lands were confirmed to the wardship of Thomas Hartwell with Eleanor as his trustee, and the king's grant was quietly set aside as founded on a petition that had not disclosed the codicil. which was a way of saying the king had signed the wrong name, without anyone having to say the king had erred. Mr. Crandall went back to town. Miss Fenwick, to her credit, married a kind baronet the following season, and was by all accounts content. And the Dowager Lady Margaret, who might have nursed her defeat into bitterness, surprised the county instead by retiring to her own portion at the far end of the estate and asking, through a stiff and careful letter, whether she might be permitted to know the boy, her great-great-nephew, before she grew too old to be of use to him, and Eleanor, who believed that a corrected person was worth more than a punished one, said yes to that as well. It was the following winter, a year almost to the day from the 12th night ball, that Eleanor stood at the window of the long library at Wexford and watched the snow come down over grounds that were her own, now hers, and Thomas's, and Henry's. The three of them folded into one household by a quiet wedding in the village church that no season had been invited to judge. The fire was high in the grate. Thomas was asleep upstairs, with his cough long cured. A healthy, noisy boy now, who feared the dark less than he had, because the house was warm and full, and someone was always near. On the small table beside the fire lay a folded letter, soft with handling, its seal long broken. And it was not the grant and not the codicil, which were filed away with the lawyers where such things belonged. It was Anne's letter, the last one, the one the household had believed the Duke could never bring himself to read. He had read it at last, that autumn, sitting beside Eleanor in this same library, and he had let her read it too, and it had said, in the hand of a dying woman who had known her husband better than he knew himself, that he was not to spend his life in the cold for her sake, that he had a great deal of warmth in him, and a habit of standing in dark passages outside rooms he longed to enter, and that she would not rest easy until he had learned to go in. Eleanor folded the letter again now, along its worn crease, and set it back upon the table where Henry liked to keep it, not as a wound any longer, but as a blessing. And she stood at the window with her husband's hand warm at the small of her back, and watched the snow fill the dark grounds, and she thought that the king had signed the wrong name, and that everything that mattered had come from the setting of it right. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Eleanor's quiet courage stayed with you, leave a word below telling me the moment you felt the room turn, and I will read everyone.